Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The snow crunched under Lyria's boots as she trudged through the frozen wasteland, her breath clouding in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The wind howled across the barren landscape, tearing at the fur-lined cloak draped over her slender frame. Each step was harder than the last, the biting cold sapping her strength, but she pressed on. She had to. The fate of her village depended on it. Valken had once been a thriving place, nestled in the valley beneath the frozen peaks. Crops grew in the fertile soil, the river ran clear and strong, and the people were hardy but content. That was before the winter had come, a winter that had refused to leave. For 5 long years, the snow had fallen without end, burying the village beneath a blanket of ice. The crops had withered, and the river had frozen solid. Now, there was nothing but death on the wind. Lyria glanced over her shoulder at her companions. Fenra, the archer, was beside her, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Behind them, the scholar Elian stumbled through the snow, his thin frame ill-suited for the rigors of the journey. And at the rear, silent as a shadow, walked Soren, the mage. He had been a last-minute addition to their group, sent by the village elders with cryptic warnings about the dangers they would face. "Keep moving," Fenra urged, her voice harsh. "We need to find shelter before nightfall." Lyria nodded, tightening her grip on the hilt of her sword. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this journey was unlike any she had ever undertaken. They were heading into the heart of the frozen peaks, in search of the Heart of Frost, a legendary gem said to have the power to control the seasons. It was their only hope of breaking the eternal winter that had gripped their land, but as they pressed forward, Lyria couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The closer they got to their destination, the more the air seemed to hum with some unseen force, as if the very land were alive and watching them. "We'll make it," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "We have to." They found shelter in the crumbling ruins of an ancient temple, half buried in the snow. The structure was little more than a shell, its walls cracked and weathered by time, but it offered some protection from the relentless wind. Lyria huddled near the small fire they had managed to coax to life, her hands extended toward the flickering flames. "This place gives me the creeps," Fenra muttered, glancing around the dim interior. "It feels wrong." Elian, ever the scholar, was crouched beside a broken pillar, studying the faded carvings etched into the stone. "These markings are old," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Very old. This temple must have been built by the same civilization that created the Heart of Frost." Soren, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally spoke. "The heart was not created," he said, his voice low. "It was found. A piece of the world itself, imbued with the power of the elements." Lyria glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "How do you know that?" The mage's eyes flickered in the firelight, unreadable. "There are things the elders don't tell you. Things better left forgotten." A chill ran down Lyria's spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. Soren had always been a mystery, even back in the village. He had arrived from the north, claiming to have knowledge of ancient magics. The elders had trusted him enough to send him with them on this journey, but Lyria wasn't so sure. Still, she couldn't deny that they needed him. The Heart of Frost was said to be guarded by powerful forces, and if they were to have any hope of retrieving it, they would need every advantage they could get. "Get some rest," she said, pulling her cloak tighter around her. "We have a long day ahead of us." As the others settled in for the night, Lyria leaned against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. But sleep did not come easily. Her mind was filled with visions of the Heart of Frost, its cold blue light pulsing like a heartbeat, calling to her. The next day dawned cold and gray, the sky a blanket of thick clouds that seemed to press down on them as they continued their ascent into the mountains. The wind had died down, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape for any signs of danger. The terrain was treacherous, the path narrow and slick with ice. More than once, Lyria had to catch herself as her foot slipped on the frozen ground. "We're close," Elian said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The temple is just ahead." Lyria nodded, but her attention was elsewhere. The strange humming sensation in the air had grown stronger, and now it seemed to vibrate through her very bones. It was as if the mountain itself were alive, watching them with cold, unfeeling eyes. "We're being followed," Fenra whispered, her hand on the hilt of her bow. Lyria stiffened, her heart racing. "Where?" Fenra pointed toward a cluster of jagged rocks in the distance. At first, Lyria saw nothing. But then, a flicker of movement caught her eye, something large and pale, moving silently through the snow. "Frost Warden," Soren muttered, his voice grim. "They guard the heart." Lyria's blood ran cold. She had heard the stories of the Frost Wardens, ancient spirits bound to the mountain, tasked with protecting the heart of frost from those who sought its power. But she had never truly believed they were real, until now. The creature emerged from the shadows, towering over them like a living statue of ice and stone. Its body was humanoid in shape, but its skin was as white as the snow around it, its eyes glowing with an eerie blue light. "Run," Lyria whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. They didn't need to be told twice. As one, they turned and fled, their feet slipping on the ice as they raced toward the temple. The warden let out a bone-chilling howl and gave chase, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. Lyria's lungs burned as she ran, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the warden gaining on them, its footsteps shaking the ground beneath her. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the creature looming closer, its eyes fixed on her with cold, unwavering focus. "Get inside," she shouted, pushing Elian ahead of her as they reached the entrance to the temple. They stumbled through the narrow doorway, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, Lyria thought they were safe. But then the warden crashed through the entrance, its massive hands reaching for her. Soren stepped forward, his hands glowing with dark energy. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a bolt of magic toward the warden, striking it in the chest. The creature let out a roar of pain but didn't stop. "Keep it distracted." Lyria shouted, drawing her sword. She charged at the warden, her blade flashing in the dim light. The creature swung at her, its massive fist narrowly missing her as she ducked beneath its arm. She slashed at its leg, but her sword glanced off its icy skin, barely leaving a scratch. "Damn it," she hissed, dodging another blow. Fenra loosed an arrow, the shaft striking the warden's shoulder. The creature snarled and turned toward her, but before it could strike, Soren unleashed another blast of magic, knocking it off balance. "Now!" Lyria shouted. She leaped forward, her sword aimed at the warden's chest. With all her strength, she drove the blade into the creature's heart, the steel sinking into its icy flesh. The warden let out one final, echoing howl before crumbling to the ground, its body dissolving into a pile of snow and ice. Lyria stood over the remains, her chest heaving with exertion. She wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to the others. "Is everyone okay?" Elian was pale but nodded. Fenra had a few cuts but nothing serious. Soren, as usual, was unreadable, his expression hidden beneath the hood of his cloak. "We need to move," he said, his voice cold. "The heart is close." Lyria hesitated, glancing at the pile of ice that had once been the warden. What if there are more? Soren's lips curled into a thin smile. Then we deal with them. The chamber that housed the Heart of Frost was deep within the mountain, hidden behind a maze of twisting tunnels and crumbling stairways. As they descended deeper into the darkness, Lyria could feel the air grow colder, the very walls of the mountain radiating an unnatural chill. At last, they reached the final chamber, a vast, open space filled with the soft blue glow of the Heart of Frost. The gem sat on a pedestal of ice at the center of the room, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. Lyria approached it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The gem was more beautiful than she had imagined, its surface smooth and flawless, as if it had been carved from the very essence of winter itself, but as she reached out to touch it, a vision filled her mind. She saw the world as it had been centuries ago, before the heart had been lost, lush forests, flowing rivers, and fields of golden wheat. And then she saw the heart being used, its power twisting and warping the land, plunging it into an eternal winter. The Heart of Frost can control the seasons, Soren said, his voice low. But it can also control the hearts of men. Lyria pulled her hand back, her chest tight with fear. What do you mean? The heart doesn't just change the weather, he said, stepping closer. It changes people. It bends them to its will, feeding off their desires, their fears. It's not just a tool, it's a weapon. Lyria's mind raced. If the heart had such power, then bringing it back to Valken could end the winter. But at what cost? We can't use it, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's too dangerous. Are you sure about that? Soren's voice was soft but dangerous. Think of what we could do with that power. We could save your village. We could save all of them. Lyria shook her head, backing away from the gem. No. I won't do it. Soren's expression darkened, and for the first time, Lyria saw the hunger in his eyes, the hunger for power. You don't have a choice. Before she could react, Soren raised his hand, and a wave of dark magic slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Fenris shouted and loosed an arrow, but Soren deflected it with a flick of his wrist. Foolish girl, he hissed, stepping toward Lyria. You could have had everything. Lyria struggled to her feet, her sword clutched tightly in her hand. I won't let you take it. Soren's lips curled into a sneer. You can't stop me. With a shout, Lyria charged at him, her sword swinging toward his chest. Soren raised his hand, and a wall of ice shot up between them, blocking her path. But Lyria didn't stop. She slammed her sword into the ice, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Soren's eyes widened in shock as she broke through his defenses, but before he could react, Lyria drove her sword into his chest. Soren gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief as he staggered backward, the dark magic fading from his hands. He collapsed to the ground, his body still and cold. Lyria stood over him, her chest heaving with exertion. She wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to Fenra, who was kneeling beside Elian's lifeless body. He's gone, Fenra whispered, her voice choked with grief. Lyria's heart sank as she knelt beside her fallen friend. Elian had been their guide, their hope, and now he was gone. But as she looked at his peaceful face, she knew what he would have wanted. She rose to her feet and turned toward the Heart of Frost, its light still pulsing softly in the center of the chamber. I can't use it, she whispered to herself. It's too dangerous. With a heavy heart, Lyria raised her sword and brought it down on the gem, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The blue light flickered and died, leaving the chamber in darkness. Lyria collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had destroyed the Heart of Frost, but as she lay there, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. The journey back to Valken was long and difficult, but when Lyria finally returned, she was greeted with hope. The eternal winter had not ended, but the first hints of spring were beginning to show. Snowdrops bloomed in the snow, and the river had begun to thaw. Lyria stood at the edge of the village, watching the people as they worked to rebuild their lives. She had not brought them the power of the heart, but she had brought them something far more important, hope, and as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Lyria knew that she had made the right choice after all.